Welcome to Put Simply, the podcast that puts what's happening in the world simply without compromising on the details. Erdem Koch is my name, Rodney McCune and Ozan Ibrisim my co-hosts. Well, last Sunday, December 14, was a devastating one in Australia's history. On one of the most iconic beaches in its largest city of Sydney, Bondi Beach, two gunmen opened fire on a Jewish event celebrating Hanukkah, killing at least 16 people and injuring many, many more. A 10-year-old girl, the youngest victim, a Holocaust survivor, another. Members of Australia's Jewish community are saying not enough was done to prevent this attack, which they say is a result of the rising tide of antisemitism across the country in recent years. We're joined today by David Imber, a communications professional in Australia, a friend of this podcast, and a member of the country's Jewish community. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, Erdem, and thanks for the opportunity. It's a tough week, but I'm glad to be discussing it with you.
Start with your immediate reaction to this horrific event, and then how you've sort of comprehended and I guess tried to make sense of what's happened since.
Yeah, look, I'm very happy to. I was at home and I got a bit of an indication. There was some early messaging that there was an incident in Bondi and people were asked to keep clear. And I had a spidey sense. It was, early evening. I was making dinner. I was quite hungover from the night before. It's Christmas party season, obviously, around the world. And I was trying to make a healthy dinner and have an early night. And I got a spidey sense. I texted a few people in Sydney and I started to realize that something bad had happened. And then, of course, I switched on the news and it was starting to dribble out. But I, I know Bondi is a very iconic Australian beach, but it's also, really one of the largest places for Jews to live in Sydney and certainly to gather. And there's always Jewish events. I've been to Jewish events in and around Bondi, even though I live in Melbourne. And so, yeah, my immediate reaction was, this is horrible, this is shocking. And I feared it would be bad. And, the very early indications were not clear, but I soon realised from my friends there that there was shooting for up to 10 minutes. We now hear it was 6 or 7 minutes of shooting, but I just assumed that there would be a lot of deaths, and there have been. But as you kind of indicated, one of the things that's been really difficult is a lot of Jews were so fearful. We felt the temperature rising. We know anti-Semitism exists and has got worse in the last few years. And there have been terrorist incidents, including a firebombing of a synagogue very close to where I used to live that has since been, um, uh, you know, um, investigated and found out to have been funded by the Iranian government through, paying of criminals in Australia, that we were expecting this. There was an expectation that there would be some sort of attack. When I went to celebrate Jewish New Year and Day of Atonement a few months ago, I thought, the synagogue is very heavily guarded, but, we've seen people killed in synagogues. So I was shocked in that sense that, it was a quiet Sunday evening and I didn't expect it then, and I didn't expect it at Bondi, but I was not surprised.
And what was the describe as the kind of emotional roller coaster that you went through in terms of, hearing it? I assume there was anger, sadness,
It
and what's
was it
been
was sad. Yeah, look, it was definitely sadness to begin with, and it's still sadness. I mean, it's sad on so many levels, and this is an Australian iconic destination. The last time I was at Bondi was probably at World Pride. It was a dance party was held there, and I'm a member of the gay community as well. Like, this is a place that most Australians have been to, and I was just incredibly upset. I felt. I was worried that there'd been a security breach. I know how secure Jewish um, events are. I mean, I'm sure members of the Islamic and other communities have similar security, but security around Jewish events are really tight. And I just thought, knowing how crowded it was, a warm night in Sydney in summer, I just, it would have been packed not just with Jews, but with everybody. And I was just incredibly sad, worried, angry, disappointed, and I just had that sick feeling. I mean, I hate to say it, but you can relate to this. You know, I'm a communications professional, so I didn't just feel the feelings immediately. I knew there would be anger. I knew there would be a political blame game. I could feel all the things that we are experiencing on Sunday night, and I just cried, and I just thought, this is so hard. People's lives have ended, and people's, kids were there, and people will be damaged by this. But I also knew that we were entering a very febrile space politically and in the media, and I didn't know where that would end. And obviously, we're still in the midst of that. So lots and lots of emotions.
There is this overwhelming sense, and you've sort of touched on it in your first answer, Dave, that this was. I hate to use the word inevitable, but that's the sort of reading that I'm taking from the outpour of mixed community reactions to this event, kind of saying that the government were warned, the authorities were warned, the police were warned, etc., and nothing was done to prevent something like this from happening. How much of that is a view that you subscribe to, and what's some of the complexities and the nuance that might be getting missed a little bit in some of the coverage in the aftermath?
I'm the grandson of Holocaust survivors. So all of my four grandparents had most of their family killed in Poland, or, what is partly now Ukraine and Poland. So I grew up knowing that anti-Semitism had an endpoint in murder and violence, and I was lucky to be here. Most Jews have that. Melbourne and Sydney have large percentages of Holocaust survivor people as a percentage of the Jewish community. It's different in places like New York, where there are lots of Jews that don't have that connection. Hatred is not new. I'm also political, and I understand that we've seen a rise in neo-Nazis, and in sort of a general coarsening of our political discourse. The other thing that is very difficult is that Jews have a long-standing relationship with Israel. And with Israel, as Jews religiously, well before the establishment of the state of Israel and all of the politics around Israel's borders and Israel's politics, you know, there are religious holy sites, for Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims in, the land of Israel and broader region. And so the politics and the devastation that has happened in Gaza over the last few years since October the 7th massacre has led to a massive spotlight on that region. And it's been very much the case that there has been a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people, I think quite legitimate sympathy for the Palestinian people who have been impacted by the response of the State of Israel. But the complex and very different for different people reactions and relationships that Jews have with Israel has made the issue of anti-Semitism very hard to deal with. So I have noticed that there has been a rise in anti-Semitism because for a lot of Jews, we have a connection to Israel that is not a connection to Benjamin Netanyahu or any of the political parties or any of the things that go on. But our Judaism connects us to a place that has been very fraught politically, war crimes allegations, crimes against humanity allegations, human rights, at The Hague hearings, protests every week in the streets of Melbourne and many other capitals around the world. So, I'm not, an emissary of the state of Israel, but I have my own relationship. I've got relatives in Israel. And so it's been very difficult to be a Jew trying to, be a Jew when it's been the biggest topic of conversation and where, particularly political activists where I often, share time with, are very motivated and very keen to engage with, talk about, protest about what's going on in Israel and Gaza. So in that context, the Australian government has also had its own, political engagement. The government has, I think, very clearly said that there is no place for anti-Semitism, that the events of October the 7th and the taking of hostages was wrong. But the government has also had a long-standing view that there should be a two-state solution and there should be a recognition of the Palestinian state. And it recognised a Palestinian state earlier in the year at the UN I think in the second half of the year. And that's been taken differently by many different Jews. Now, this is difficult. You've got me on the program, and obviously I'm Jewish and I've got my views. I don't speak for all Jewish people. There are people who feel that the government should not have recognised the state of Palestine while there was a war that was started by Hamas, that there should not have been as much leeway for Palestinian protests because some elements of those protests contained anti-Semitism in it. There's been a whole lot, there's a whole lot of different views about this. I guess my view is the government was trying to walk a very difficult line between saying it was supportive of Jews and having an anti-Semitism envoy, and at the same time supporting free speech and supporting the rights of Palestinian people and the rights of Australian people to protest on their behalf. And it was not, I think, able to strongly enough hold the complexity that some people were going to use the legitimate protests for Palestinian people to prosecute their long-time hatred of Jews. We do have a very harmonious country for all of the foreign listeners. I have very good friends who are Muslim. I have very good friends who are Arab Christians. This cross-cultural stuff, happens naturally in Australia. But there are radical Islamists in Australia. There are people who have wanted to commit acts of terrorism in Australia, and we've always known that, and our security services have always known it. And under the cover of legitimate protests and, sometimes pretty coarse barbs on Israel, Jews have been a bit of collateral damage, and the slur of Zionism, has been used in ways that have felt very much like anti-Semitism to a lot of Jews. So that's a very long answer to your question, but there's quite a bit of complexity around what the government's done and could have done. Certainly a lot of Jews feel like they haven't done enough to combat anti-Semitism. And, that sort of context of what's been happening. It hasn't been 2 years where Israel and the Palestinian territories have been relatively peaceful. It's been a very difficult couple of years. So that context is inescapable for me.
No, you make some excellent points there, Dave, and I guess one of the reasons why we were so keen to speak to you today is because you can hold that complexity, right, of that two things can be true at the same time, that you can recognize the atrocities of what's happening and what has been happening in Gaza and still support Israel's right to exist. You can exercise your freedom of speech when it comes to the cause of the Palestinian people, and you can still be outraged by the anti-Semitism that is clearly growing in Australia. And I guess the question is, why is it so difficult for the government and thought leaders of society to hold that level of complexity? Because the public is one thing. We've seen incidents, not to this scale, but dangerous incidents get out of hand very quickly in Australia. The Cronulla riots turned into something that should have just been a fight between teenage boys on the streets of Cronulla, then turned into this sort of racial element to it. We saw everything that happened in Australia post-September 11 and the targeting of mosques and Muslim communities and whatnot. And I, as someone who was raised in a Muslim household, certainly felt that growing up or in high school in Australia as well. You've just, wonderfully outlined some of your experiences in that. The community, I think we can understand that things can spill over, that complexity cannot necessarily be held by all elements of society. But why has the government, why have the thought leaders of Australia failed to hold this particular complexity, do you think?
It's a really good point. And I think it comes down, there are so many ways to answer this, but I'll say a couple of things. Both the Jewish and the Muslim communities, and I guess the more broader Arab communities, because not all Arabs are Muslim, and there's a lot of complexity around, identity in this. We're both minority religions in Australia and minority communities in Australia, and multiple things can be true. I've got plenty of friends across different religions and groups, but there is also racism and, Islamophobia and anti-Semitism that people feel. And as an optimistic multicultural nation, we find it difficult to have honest conversations about the fact that there is racism in Australia. It is not, I think, as pervasive as some places in the world, but we do have racism in Australia. And yet it doesn't feel like the nation we want to be to have the hard conversations. And so we often don't. And at a time when there's an external conflict, which clearly impacts so many people here, you know, there are Palestinian refugees here, there are Israelis and Jews, you know, and people with human rights and other interests in what's going on in a conflict. You know, when all of that emotion is high, it's very difficult to deal with it, particularly in an environment, as you know, and you've talked on the podcast before. You know, we're in a news cycle and in a political cycle, which does not, which does not sort of benefit from nuance. Like, you know, Donald Trump is not a nuance kind of guy. You know, there is not a nightly news that we all sit around the television as a family and watch anymore. People get their information second, third, and fourth hand on social media. People get slices of information and believe it. There's more fake news and disinformation and misinformation. So, in that environment, it's very easy for people to, you know, take an image of an Israeli soldier swearing about a Palestinian person and say, this is the view of every Israeli soldier and this is what every soldier is doing. Or, you know, war crimes or whatever it is, you know, on all sides. But there has been barbarism, you know, from Hamas that is not people who support the Palestinian people have not wanted to talk about because it's too inconvenient to on the one hand, feel like Palestinian people are the victims, but have to realize that some of them have been the aggressors. These are complicated emotions to hold. And I just think the Australian government, you know, has not always wanted to have these conversations because there's politics around them. You know, the Liberal Party have chosen to be very muscularly in support of the Jewish community. It didn't help them in my seat of McNamara. They didn't get an increase in votes. But there were signs all around my community at the election in May encouraging Jews to vote for the Liberal Party because they supported Israel and they supported Jews. And at the same time, you've got Pauline Hanson increasing her share of the vote, leader of the One Nation, you know, right-wing xenophobic party. So there's all sorts of political, media, and other reasons why the sort of degree of difficulty for unity was so hard, but you know is now kind of exposed, and hopefully we have a better future as a result of this terrible act.
I mean, I think you've put it really well, and you know, there's very little I can add to that, but you know, I will draw from, I guess, my own experience as living in a, you know, as being a migrant. I moved to
Mm,
Australia when I was 7 years old. Went through, you know, the classic kind of difficulties and challenges that somebody who would grow up in a minority community. And I have to say that, you know, the way that Australia welcomed me and the way that the Australian community embraced me and has had a tradition of more than tolerating, but defending and protecting those people from minority communities. I think that's one of the biggest strengths, and almost I think it's a, you know, one of the biggest differences in the way that the Australian community and the government across the political spectrum has been able to, you know, balance some of those tensions that come with multiculturalism and that come with people living in the same country, coming from backgrounds, you know, who may have had not just years but centuries, in fact, thousands of years worth of conflict outside of the country, you know, coming and being able to live harmoniously. Um, you know, but that to me, in some ways, ended on Sunday because we've always felt that this sort of thing could never happen in Australia. Australians always been, or Australia has always been different in the way that it's dealt with these issues.
yeah.
We have a lot more tolerance towards one another, all that sort of stuff. And to me, I feel sadness on many levels, but that ended in some ways. And and I think, you know, we have to address some of the main kind of drivers of that. And I think whilst what I just described as being a amazing part of the Australian experience and the Australian multicultural experience, some of the downsides of that, or some of the, I guess, consequences of that, we haven't been able to deal with very well. And let me just unpack some of those consequences. In our effort, which is a very noble and humane effort to protect what we might call vulnerable communities, we have a level of tolerance, I think, sometimes that is a bit beyond what should be extended to some of the ideas in those communities. And, I'll be very open. I refer to jihadism. I refer to Islamic radicalism. These are both Adam and I come from this community in terms of background, and these ideas, these ideologies exist. I mean, you can deny it all you like. Now, we're not stupid enough to say that that's what Islam is about. Of course, it's not. But, most people, regardless of their religion, are decent, peace-seeking, and, very human people. Um, and but unfortunately, as a community, we have not been able to kind of uh, get that balance right about weeding certain bad ideas out of vulnerable communities, without coming across as being intolerant of them, or not doing our job as a good multicultural country of defending them, and giving them the space to be their own, or to have their own identity, and all of this sort of stuff. And these are the
Couldn't agree
types
with you
of
more.
um, and these are the types of nuanced kind of things that I get really upset about when people are out there talking about certain issues, and protesting on the streets, which, I this is a part of our tradition and culture, and what have you. But some of those nuances are lost in that, because what you will have at a pro-Palestinian rally, um, you know, or a rally that's protesting against some of the horrendous, if you ask me, actions of the Netanyahu government. What you'll have is you'll be rubbing shoulders with people from very, very different backgrounds. But the most important thing is they're there for different reasons. You'll have
Yeah.
people who are, very much committed to, and probably been committed to for the last 20, 30 years, to defending a the Palestinian community, which is a very noble cause, and something I think that we all agree with, that we need to have a two-state solution. We've said this on the show many, many times before. Next to that person, you'll have, somebody who is there because they've grown up and they've been indoctrinated to hate Jewish people. Probably don't know why, but whether that's driven by their religion or whatever. And then you'll have many, many other different people. So when you bring a coalition of people who, in their natural and normal, ordinary lives, would have very, very little reason to hang out with one another, you build a movement that is very much, um, you know, looking for a common enemy. And unfortunately, this movement, that's occupied by many, many different people from different walks of life, politics, religion, no religion, etc., have been have lost that nuance about it, and have identified, the Jewish community as the common enemy. And this is where the nuance, this is where leadership comes in. And this is where I think, we haven't seen that level of leadership to be able to say that, you know, we all come from different backgrounds. If you're on the street protesting, etc., and we don't need a common enemy. We may have a common purpose, but we don't need a common enemy. And the common purpose in this case should be to ensure that you know a solution is brought forward. Innocent civilians stop getting murdered in Gaza. The Netanyahu government is held responsible, but also understanding that you know, um, the response or the Israeli government's response is also justified in response to the October 7 attacks. They have an ability and or a right to defend themselves as well. We should be able to hold all of these thoughts, get on the streets and fight for a common purpose and not against a common enemy. And this is where I think this is where we've failed, I think, the Australian multicultural experience. And I think the leadership has been lacking. And I'm not talking about just political leadership. We've all been involved in politics. This is an impossible kind of balance to get right in this 24-hour cycle. But I think community leadership on this issue has really failed, and it's very, very sad.
So I think that's a really good point, Ozan, and I've listened to what everyone has said, and without that community leadership, um, and I don't think it ever is down to a political level. I do think it's a community level to manage down that anger and rage that can develop, especially when there's something going on elsewhere that you feel particularly um, uh, emotionally connected to. And I think that, there will be a temptation to blame the government that they haven't done enough. Um, but that's because it's really difficult to process. So, a couple of individuals could cause so much harm. The truth is governments can never really do enough, especially if you're in a liberal democracy where these events are more likely to happen because there's more freedoms for one people to become radicalized, but also to access the means to do something that's particularly difficult. And again, you know, the government is managing what is, I'm going to call it exported tensions, because it's something that's happening elsewhere that they can't directly resolve, but is the underlying context where people's frustration and anger tips into hatred and um, motivation to do really terrible things. So it's hugely difficult for a government to respond to that. And you know, I'm not sure that that's the right conversation to have. What I do wonder though is, and David, you touched on it about, you know, people seeing events or, the conduct of one side or one grouping within um, Hamas and what's happening or what an Israeli soldier might be doing. I do wonder what role social media is playing to accelerate radicalism or radicalization, where people
Well,
are in their echo chambers and they're seeing maybe, you know, people they identify with as repeatedly a victim on social media, maybe never seeing broader context or balance, and that's an additional factor that maybe during the I'm going to say the troubles in Northern Ireland, where obviously I grew up, where you could see this sort of level of anger and division spilling into, quite unpleasant violence. We didn't even have that as part of the background, and now I see that that's just an additional factor, which makes it super difficult for the government to manage these types of community tensions, and in the absence of very strong community leadership, and I don't know what it is like on the ground in Australia, obviously. Yeah, they're real challenges, and this isn't about people who say this is so bad, we can never do this again, this mustn't happen. There's more terrible things that will happen unless there's a way of reducing temperature, which must come within communities where radicalization has taken place, and that's really challenging, I think.
Oh, you've raised some huge points, Rodney, and really important ones. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind that social media has not made this easier. It's made it harder for all sorts of reasons. Certainly, the lack of context, the lack of desire for nuance. I mean, social media, the algorithm doesn't, you know, doesn't push posts that are nuanced. It pushes posts that are emotive and emotional. Um, it also facilitates, very rushed, incomplete, and can be quite harming conversations. I mean, I have had instances where I have raised with friends of mine who I didn't think were anti-Semitic, who had said something to do with the conflict in the Middle East, to do with, with Gaza and Israel. I had highlighted the fact that I thought that that was, language, imagery, something which, I thought crossed a line. And on at least two occasions I can remember, and probably three, I was snapped back and told, I didn't think you supported genocide. I didn't think you supported the killing of children. And I had to say, as quick as I could type on my phone to somebody in a direct message, that actually, no, I've not stopped or mentioned any of the dozens of posts you've done that I thought have identified, even if some of them have been awkward for me to look at. I haven't stopped you. But if you're putting photos of a Shylock type character up representing the Israeli government, and you are dehumanizing Jews in the process of making, whatever claim you want to make, that's difficult. And this is, an experience of me with friends of mine. It is not easy to sort of highlight that on a, on a national stage. And also, I can't, as a Labor Party member, not say that some of the hypocrisy on the Liberal side has been hard to take. They are a free speech party. They have actively, over many decades, argued against restrictions on free speech to stop hate speech. Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, if anyone wants to Google those debates that George Brandis and others had at the time. Yet, in this conflict, the Liberal Party have decided to support Jews and have said we should stop having Palestinian protests, we should stop having speech which is offensive, in a reversal of the way in which they have normally run their political, ideology. So there's been lots of challenges. Social media is part of it, but this has also been very politicized in Australia. And I do not blame some of my fellow Jews who have seen the Liberal Party with pro sort of Jewish muscular statements, feeling like they're the party for me. That didn't work locally in my electorate, but I can actually understand that. And so that's part of the reaction, the anger, is the sense that this has been politicised. I'm not saying that the Labor Party has been perfect. I don't think they have done enough on anti-Semitism, and I think um, they should have realised that in doing what I think is the right thing, and in seeking to support the Palestinian people, I don't think they've realised that the high degree of difficulty that you needed to be able to continue to say we are doing these things for Palestinian people and we are supporting Jews in Australia, whatever their views are. That's all been very hard, very complicated, high degree of difficulty. And it's been difficult for the Prime Minister this week. He's, I think, sort of got there, but the first few days after the massacre at Bondi, the Prime Minister looked completely lost and was not invited to some funerals, which is pretty rare.
I was actually
I've
going
got
to
a,
ask. Sorry, go, Ozan.
no, I was going to say that I think, the politicization of this has been not surprising. But, I think a lot, when you have some of these politicians showing the anger, and I think, I don't question the sincerity of that anger, but then spinning it around to say that, this is the government's fault, etc. This sort of stuff is not helpful. And I think what would be very interesting when, when the kind of period of grief, I guess, is over in the community, or the immediate grief, people come to terms with it and maybe think clearly. It would be very interesting to see where the politics of this goes, because I think, from my experience in the Australian community, and talking to some of my friends who I would not expect them to have a strong view one way or another, etc. Um, I think many people are kind of fed up with the politics, and many people also are viewing this as, well, this is where politics has got us. We're a harmonious society, generally speaking, etc. Um, but the politicization of these issues, all of this sort of stuff, I get the sense that if you're, looking at this in a very pure political way, you've got to be very careful, because I think many people have switched off the politics and have now started to question, to Rodney's point, why are we in Australia why are we dealing with this, you know, imported problem?
Yeah.
And I hate using that term,
Yeah.
but when you live in Australia, you live in a bit of a bubble, and
Mm.
Australia is very far from all of these conflicts, but tends to be somewhat involved in, growing up. It was the conflicts about the Serbs and the Croats. I remember. I'm sure
Yes.
David and Erdem would also remember. And the general consensus, or the general view of the community back then was, well, why are we having these arguments? Why are Australians fighting
Mm.
each other about issues and topics that have nothing to do with us here in Australia, etc. Now, of course, I think this topic is very different to that. I think this cuts deeper, this topic. But I think if you're looking at the political fallout from
Mm.
this, I suspect many people will be upset with both sides, and will go,
I, I
okay, why are we having this conversation?
I think you're right, and I just want to say a couple of very brief things on this. It should not be ignored the fact that we have had a very significant period of sustained inflation, cost of living, housing unaffordability. It is so easy at times like that for parties of the right to say this is the problem of immigrants.
Yeah.
So, this notion of othering, comes in a number of different ways. And I've certainly seen even friends of mine in the LGBTIQA plus community, normally on the left of politics, you know, saying, maybe this is an immigration problem. The other thing which I think is important to say is there's no evidence that this father and son who did this heinous act were actually influenced by the Palestinian issue. So I know we've spent a lot of time and I've talked about it, but I want to make that point clear. I think they've got a radical Islamist ideology. And part of what's difficult about that, and what's difficult in our nation, as you've kind of alluded to, Ozan, is you know, nations tell stories about who they are. And one of the stories we've told about ourselves as a nation, and the story my grandparents told me is, Australia is a safe haven. It's a place of multiculturalism. And it is. And for most people, and for most of my life, I've had an amazing time here. And for most of my grandparents' life, they did too. The thing that's difficult, though, is we do have pockets of people who despite, I think acceptably being able to have their faith and have their traditions and have their customs, we don't have a good way of drawing lines and saying, there are certain things which are, frankly, to use a very badly overused Australian expression, are un-Australian. There are views that are too extreme for our country, and it's very difficult for people on the left to want to say, you can't be who you are and you can't, you can't live your full self. But some of the views, we've discussed this offline, some of the views that people have, radical Islamist views, are antithetical to the Islamic faith and are antithetical to Australian values. And I have never been a sort of, let's, keep funding the security services kind of person. I do come from the left, but there are people who we need to arrest and prosecute. And all of this is difficult, going back to what Rodney said, partly due to social media. It's a lot easier in the old days when people would go and meet and you could, spy on people meeting and they could do telephone calls and you could tap their phones and find out what they're planning. Now you've got, presumably, we'll find out with the investigation, a father and a son, you know, cooking this up themselves in private. It's very hard to know who to arrest and who to hold, when to draw those lines in a democracy where, traditionally it's been acceptable to have whatever thoughts you have, but, you can't do violent acts. So all of that is part of it.
You touched on the politics a bit, Dave, but just to, I guess, sort of wrap up, from a political perspective, you mentioned the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese struggling in those early days, and there was a lot of contrast joined with contrast made with Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, who dealt with the Christchurch attacks on the mosque, and the way she embraced the Muslim community, and a lot of those images and that really humane leadership that came out in those early days. Before then, the politics sort of came out. Why do you think the Labor Prime Minister here struggled? And then, so question one, and question two, where do they take it now? I mean, there's been talks around gun reforms and looking into, launching things that would investigate this rise of anti-Semitism and what can be done. But talk us through, from a purely political sense, those, I guess, those two lenses that we can apply to this horrific incident.
Yeah, so, it's a good comparison with Jacinda Ardern. She had not faced, and I'm not an expert in New Zealand politics, but from my memory, she had not faced a period of time where sections of the Muslim community in New Zealand thought she was not on their side. So when she put on a headscarf and went to funerals and went to mosques, she wasn't coming from a position that, she had maybe not done enough to deserve to be there. Rightly or wrongly, and obviously this makes me uncomfortable as a Labor Party member, the Labor Premier of Victoria and the Prime Minister have been booed by some Jews at events they've gone to in the past couple of years. There has been a sense by a reasonable number of Jews, it's hard to know how many, but a decent section of the Jewish community, that Jews have not received enough support from government. So that already put them on the back foot when there was an incident where, people like me, honestly and genuinely, were worried that something would happen, and now it has. That obviously puts a government on the back foot. Even though they had done an anti-Semitism, had hired Gillian Siegel as an anti-Semitism envoy, they had done things. The perception in the community was they hadn't done enough. And the perception on the Liberal side of politics is, we are here 115%. So I think it's been a little bit difficult for the government because it's sort of been walking the line. Where do they go? I mean, obviously, the Prime Minister did start to talk about guns very strongly because it is incredibly rare for there to be gun violence. It's the worst gun crime since Port Arthur. So he went there, but then some Jews quickly said, and others said, this looks like you're focusing on guns rather than anti-Semitism. So he's focusing on anti-Semitism as well. There's going to be further laws for hate speech, further support for security and other things for Jewish people. This ultimately is going to be fought out politically, and it ultimately is a bit of a fight for the soul of our nation. And that is where Josh Frydenberg, the former treasurer who was interviewed this week, and is a very prominent member of the Jewish community, he used those words. There is a sense that this is, perhaps a bit of a case study of where things can go wrong. And I think the Liberal Party, who are heavily divided and struggling, are going to jump on this. And so the politics won't be easy. The idea of bipartisanship after a crisis is almost been expected, and I don't think we're going to see it this time. So I think it's going to be difficult for the Prime Minister. I think he's making the steps he needs to make, and I'm pleased to see that. But, there's a National Day of reflection on Sunday, a week later. So he's trying to do things, but it's a very difficult time. For those in the rest of the world, you might not realise, it's very warm here in Australia. People are on the eve of Christmas, which really marks our summer holidays. He's got about 2 or 3 business days to do stuff before people go on holidays. And traditionally in Australia, don't really think about politics again till February. If people go to Christmas holidays worried that the government doesn't really have a handle on safety, security, that becomes a competence issue, and that's a big problem for the government. So I suspect we will see a lot of stuff in the next few days in the lead up to Christmas so that government can send people to Christmas when they're with their family with a sense of safety and security. But it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, so well put, Dave. This podcast is called Put Simply, but this was one of those episodes where I think we really needed to delve into the complexity, because it is hugely complex. It is hugely requiring of nuance, and I think you've supplied that so wonderfully, given your personal connection to all of this. And I think it's so refreshing to hear from someone who can do that. So thank you so much for doing that and for your time today.
Thank you for your podcast and for your, providing the space. It's very tricky. I'm thinking of all of the different Jews I know and all of the different non-Jews I know who have been affected this week. It is incredibly sad, and I'm glad I've got through without crying. But thank you for the opportunity. It's not been a good week.
No, and thanks again, Dave. But stay on for a couple of minutes because we do want your opinion on one more thing, which is
Sure.
Vanity Fair, Rodney, in the US. What on earth is happening there?
Well, I'm an avid reader of Vanity Fair. It's one of my favorite publications. And
Well, I used to be when Christopher Hitchens was writing for it, but
obviously Susie Wiles had her 11 interviews. Is that right, by the way?
yeah, it is 11 interviews. Yeah.
It's
I
fantastic.
missed the number, but I mean, I'm here for this conversation. This was actually the
This is
relief at the
crazy,
end of the
right?
week I
And
needed to see.
yeah, and that the highlights that come out of it where Trump's got the personality of an alcoholic, whatever that means. That Vance is a conspiracy theorist, that she cautioned them against tariffs. I mean, the list of criticisms or insights into the workings of the administration just go on and on and on. And yet she's a director of communications, right? Is that her official, or
No,
is she
she's the
chief of
chief of
staff?
staff.
She's the chief of
Sorry,
staff.
my
Yeah.
apologies. How the hell did she not know that this was going to play out in this way? It's insane that they didn't know that doing these interviews and saying those things might produce these headlines. Unless it was unless it was deliberate in order to, who knows what the objective is. But anyway, yes, everyone else can now share, starting with you, David, what your favorite point is.
Thank you, Rodney. I think the irony of this is that it's called Vanity Fair, and I think vanity led down this road. Um, there is no way that any sane chief of staff would have submitted herself to these many interviews and this many photos as some
Amazing.
kind of victory lap before the end of the first year of a 4-year presidential term. It's the height of arrogance and stupidity to have done this profile. And for Vanity Fair to not only write it the way they have, but take the photos that have been taken by Christopher Anderson is something to behold. There are so many interesting hot takes from art critics about comparisons between Stephen Miller's photo and Goebbels' photo. It is, really quite a work of art, and just amazing to behold. But really, talk about an own goal. This was not required. The people who support the president, whatever we think, and I'm obviously not a Trump supporter, but whatever you think about the president, the people who support the president are supposed to be there to have their back, not to have, kind of some profile, piece in the middle of a presidential term. It's so badly timed. It's so badly managed on their part. It's inexcusable, but congratulations to Vanity Fair. It's excellent reading and beautiful photos.
Ozan, you're a man
Oh
with
no,
an
I
eye
mean,
for.
well, it's been a long time since I've even heard Vanity Fair's name, and I think it's really quite well, I mean, it's an own goal really. At the end of the day, this is a really, really bad lapse in judgment from somebody who has always been described as a political genius, has been kind of labeled as the mastermind behind Trump's campaign, has kept the campaign and everything together. In fact, she's in the Vanity Fair articles, she's described herself as surrounding herself with junkyard dogs, which apparently means aggressive political operators, while she stays controlled and disciplined. This is anything but controlled and disciplined. The fact that you will allow Vanity Fair to come and do this and not have any control over it is beyond me. I mean, it's amateur hour, really.
My favorite little insight statistic comes from Wikipedia page views, which shows that her own page viewing increased over 3 days by 400,000, which is exactly which I'm sure you'll all agree, not what Trump would want, is to be sharing the limelight. Never mind the negative comments that are being reported on. Crazy stuff.
Well, I think Vanity Fair was the exact light point to end what has otherwise been a very difficult week indeed. David Imber, thank you so much for your time this week and your nuance and your wonderful explaining of your feelings and what's happening in Australia. Really appreciate you being here. And to Ozan and Rodney, good chatting this week, gents. See you next.
Thank
Thanks
you.
very
Thank
much.
you, David.
Thanks,
Thank you.
David.